you doing? Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We'll probably get more people in here. I'm sure there's some people watching from home, watching the live stream. So this is week 3. We're going to be doing fixed width, CSS layout techniques, and a little bit of CSS review. As far as our assignments go, make sure this is okay. This is picking up, streaming, everything is good. So assignment number 1 is due. Technically, it's due Friday, but for anybody who hasn't finished that yet, I would say get that done immediately. That's meant to be review, so it shouldn't take too long. I realize a lot of people haven't taken this class in a while, but try to get past that and then move on to the next assignment, which we will start today. This probably won't make sense just yet, but it's going to be due in 2 weeks exactly. Okay, I didn't want to stretch it all the way out to the end of the week because that's getting a little too far out there. I'd like to grade some of these and move on. Okay, so mark your calendars, make sure you remember that due date, and you can always just click the assignment. And I think that's it. So we'll just get right into writing some code here. Okay, so in your CGS4828 folder, let's go ahead and create a new folder. So today's the 9/8/2020. Open up brackets. Go to File. So there's two ways to do this. I used to do it like here, Open Folder, but it might be easier for most people just to go to File, Open Folder. And then today's, so CGS4828. Today's date. And we're going to start a new example. So File, New. Under, I think it's class resources, wherever that is. Oh, links. Yeah. Sorry. Some of the other classes I name it resources. For a reason I called it links here. And then HTML shell. And then let's copy, paste, save, ex1.html. Don't forget there's a useful extension. So if I click this and I go to available, it's called Beautify. You can see I already have it installed here, but mine says update. I'm not going to bother with that right now. I don't want to have to deal with that. But most people, if you don't have it installed, it should say install. And then once it's installed, you can go to edit, click this, beautify and save. And every time you save, it'll do the indent and styling type things for you. The general rule is that every time you open up a tag, you should indent one level. As you can see here, head, and then these got indented. We closed the tag, so then body would be outdented, I think is the correct term, and then anything inside of here would be indented one level. So we're going to very quickly go over CSS Basics, and then we'll get right into the actual using it to write a fixed width page. So I might have a W3 Schools CSS link. Yeah, so down here we can go W3 Schools CSS. So again, I'm under links. If you scroll down a little bit, you get W3 Schools CSS. Now there's HTML, which is for the structure of the page, and then CSS, which is for styling. So anything to do with layout, anything to make fonts larger, change their color, so forth, that's going to be handled through CSS. It stands for Cascading Style Sheets. So there are three ways to insert CSS. There's external, which we're not going to really bother with in this course. It's fairly simple to learn. It just makes the examples a little bit more difficult if we have to flip back and forth between two files. But in practice, you tend to use external a lot, but it's fairly simple once you've gotten good at internal and inline. Let's not worry about internal right now, so we'll talk about inline. And we talked about inline before. With inline, you use an HTML attribute. In this case, it's called style, equals, and then in double quotes, we have our various CSS properties. So in this case, they have a property called color, and they're setting it to the value blue. Another property called text align, and they're setting it to center. So let's go over here to brackets. And let's say, for example, we have we'll just use a plain paragraph here, and then let's put lorem ipsum in here. I might not have a link for that, but it's sorry, I'll just so we've got our single paragraph of lorem ipsum text, and just to make sure everything's working correctly, I'm just going to use this preview button up here. Yours might not look this large because I've zoomed in a little bit here, so you can see everything. So inline, the way inline works is that I do style equals, and then let's keep it simple, just say color is, pick any of these, cornflower blue, I guess, it's fine. And so you see here the color is like a bluish color. Now if I enter in another paragraph, you'll notice here that the second paragraph did not get that styling. And the way Inline Styles works is that it's from where you define it. Let me restate that. So the way Inline Style works is that from the start of wherever you define it, so in this case right here, until the end, everything in the middle is going to be using that. So say, for example, we also did let's underline it as well. And when you have multiple properties, you should, I guess, always do this, but we separate each property with a semicolon. I think I forgot to put the semicolon before. It'll still recognize it if you have one property without the semicolon, but it'll cause problems. It's just a good habit to always get into. Sometimes I forget, but so we have the CSS property name, its value, semicolon, CSS property name, so text decoration, colon, the value, and then a semicolon again. Okay, so here we have two properties, but notice that they only applied to the first paragraph. Let's say, for example, I did something like put in EM in here for emphasis. Notice that the second word right here with the EM emphasis, that it is blue. And that's because even though we've started a new tag, because it's kind of enclosed from here to here, and because it's, you know, in here inside of this area that we've surrounded our EM with, it's still going to be blue and underlined. And then the same thing still applies. Notice that if you click around, some stuff happens. It actually has a built-in web server, and there's some magic happening in the background. You can always just open up the main page if that's confusing. Okay. So this is what it would actually look like to the user. But okay. So that's inline. Internal. So let's go back to W through schools. So how to add CSS. So that was inline. You can read a bit more about it here. Internal is where we, inside of this head section, we have style, and then we include CSS here. Now when we have internal, we have 3 additional ways that we can define what are called selectors. It's under here. Okay. So we have the element selector, ID, and class. So let's go through here. So let's, still using our same example. So inside of the head section, we're going to say style. Now using the different selectors, we'll start with the element selector. I say the name of the tag, so in this case it's just P for paragraph, and then I do the curly braces, and that surrounds my rule. I'm saying, okay, paragraphs are going to have this rule applied. And let's say we want text align, justify, so get some practice with some other stuff here. Really shrink it here. That's good. Okay, that's good. So notice that for both paragraphs, it's justified. And justified essentially means that it's like evenly aligned on both sides. Notice that there's versus like center would be, so it does its best to try to stretch out or compress spacing in words and so forth so that it's even here, same thing here. Okay, and that's applied to both paragraphs because it's saying for all paragraphs on this page, I want this rule to be applied. And if you had a second rule that you wanted to apply as well, you'd put that here. We've already used color, but if you wanted to use color or something like that, we'll keep it simple here. Let's do this. We'll do, just so we get some practice, we'll also do the font size, and we'll say 18 pixels, I guess. Okay, so, and same deal. So if we have multiple rules, we put a semicolon to separate those. So it's going to be the property name, colon, the value, in this case justify, and then a semicolon. And then we have another property that we want to apply, the font size. That's going to be 18 pixels, and the semicolon at the end. And the reason that this applies to both paragraphs is because inside of the style section, we put an internal style sheet, and this is what's called an element selector. Now, if we wanted to use another selector, let's say, for example, H1, that might be the title of your page. Notice that not everything is red. Only H1s are red. Not everything is blue and underlined. Only that first paragraph is underlined. Not everything is justified. It's kind of difficult to see here because it doesn't wrap around, but you get the idea. And this has a different font size. It took the default H1. Okay, so this right here is called an inline style. Make sure you know that terminology, inline style. Let's just check to make sure that's still streaming here. Everything's good. Okay. So this is called an inline style, and it applies from here to the closing tag. This is called an internal style sheet, and then we use these things called selectors. This is called the element selector, and for all paragraph elements or paragraph tags, it's going to apply the rules between the curly brace to paragraphs, and then here it's going to apply this rule to H1. Okay, so let's start a new example. Let's explore some of the other selectors. So we'll go to HTML shell. Copy, this is going to be example2.html. And while you're setting that up, we're going to go over to, so we just did the element selector. Selects all HTML elements based on the element name, so in this case, paragraph. We'll skip over ID for now, and then we'll go to class. Class and ID are very similar. The only difference is that class is reusable, and ID you really only want to use once. It'll still render, but it'll cause other problems if you try to reuse it. We'll get to that in a minute. So class. So these only apply to internal style sheets and external. Right now we're not even going to worry about external, but they're very similar. The only difference between internal and external is that you take the stuff between the style tags and you put that in an external file and you import it. But the nice thing about that is you can share it across pages. So there's a reason that it's used. But so here we're dealing with internal style sheets. So inside of the head section, we need style. And because we're going to worry about selectors, we already talked about paragraph selector and H1 selector. Now let's talk about class selectors. And the way class selectors work are that we do a dot so that it knows it's not an element, but that it's a class, and then the thing that we want to apply it to. So in this case, we're going to make a class called announcement. We make this class. It doesn't, it's not built in. Like the element names are built in to HTML. We can't just magically invent those. Here, we create names, and these should be good names. So let's say announcement. We want the announcement to be slightly larger than normal. Oops. So we'd say like 110%. And we want the color to stand out, so some sort of red. Doesn't really matter what. Orange red. That might be easy to mistype. Let's just stick with regular red. And then here we'll make it H1. And let's say, for example, the H1 represents like the title of the announcement. So it might be assignment 1 due. Now to apply announcement, we do a HTML attribute called class. So we say class equals, and then in double quotes, we put the name of it without the dot. The dot only applies up here. So here we would put announcement without the dot. What's nice about using this class is that I haven't really tied it in any way to this H1 specifically. So what I mean by that is, say for example, we also have, so if H1 represents the title of the announcement, and then underneath we have a longer description. And we'll just paste in lorem ipsum. Let's use this from before. Notice that because when I defined announcement up here, I didn't really say, okay, only apply announcements to H1s or paragraphs or anything like that. It's just saying that the font needs to be larger and the color needs to be red, which can be applied to a lot of different things. It can be applied to divs, articles, spans, EMs, pretty much most, if not all, tags that are available. And most tend to follow this rule. There are some very specific things like toward tables and lists and things like that, but many of these can be applied to any tag. Not all, but many. And so what that means is anytime I have something that's announcement related, I might want to have announcements to have a uniform look. And here I can apply it to the H1 and the paragraph. And then notice that the H1 and the paragraph, the text is slightly larger. And the color is also red. Now we can mix these as well. Say, for example, we wanted this paragraph to be a part of an announcement, but for some reason we also might want things underlined. We could say style equals text, is it decoration to underline? Yeah. So we'll say that the paragraph is a part of the announcement class. It uses the announcement class, but we also want to underline it. And that's the cascading part of CSS, is that it lets us cascade rules down. The cascading ordering and all that can get a little bit complicated, but we'll talk a little bit about it, just the simple cases. But in this case, it's very simple. All it's done is, in addition to font size and color, it's also given it some text decoration. Finally, there is ID. So notice that we used class here in H1 and in paragraph. ID is meant to be unique. Let's actually do this with a new example. Let's keep these examples kind of small. So that'll be it for that example. Let's go to File, New. And this will be EX3. Okay. So what we might want to do is have something unique. So inside of head, we'll put style. And to define a class, we used dot. To define an ID, we used the hash symbol or the number symbol or whatever you want to call it. They use the term hash, so we'll stick with that. And the idea is that the ID is supposed to be unique. Now, it may seem strange, but what ends up happening is that once you mix JavaScript or other programming languages into this, in JavaScript specifically, there's a function called getElementById. And if you're only expecting one element with that ID, the function works correctly. If you've reused that ID, it gets kind of complicated because if you're returning multiple things. Now, if you're not creating a page that involves JavaScript, to be perfectly honest, ID is not used. You could get away with just sticking to classes and never using ID. ID is more for if you're going to mix JavaScript. And specifically, there's a function, getElementById. I don't know if that rings a bell from the scripting for websites class, getElementById. But the way that works is, like if I want to dynamically do something on an element using JavaScript, I would call it getElementById. I'd get a reference to that specific element, And then I could do interesting things with it. Like, for example, if I wanted to validate input, like if it was a part of a form, I would call it get element by ID on an input, and that input might have the name or the ID, let's say first name, and I would make sure that the first name is greater than 0 characters, that sort of thing. If you had multiple IDs called first name, then all of a sudden it gets kind of complicated because you have to kind of loop over it. And there is a way to loop over the classes as well, but that's kind of the reasoning behind this. But like I said, if you're not involving JavaScript, it's not as often used. So let's keep it simple. Like, say, for example, we've got an ID called page title. And we want our page title to be, I hate to use the same properties over and over again, but let's just keep it simple. We just want it to be underlined, so we'll do text, text decoration, underline, and the way we apply it is that we say ID equals page title. Now if we try to reuse this, it'll still render, and this is kind of a common theme with HTML, is that a lot of times you can do things that are wrong on your page and it'll still do its best to render the page. But it's incorrect and it's going to cause problems later down the road. So be very careful with ID. In general, like I said, you're probably not going to use it if you're not involving JavaScript. Okay, so this right here is invalid. You could only use it just that one time on the page. Let's very briefly talk about naming. So we'll just leave it at that for the example because, like I said, we're not going to use ID a whole lot in this class. And my default, by the way, is almost always class. And then if I know I'm going to have to involve some sort of JavaScript, then I'll go back. And sometimes these are even generated from some other backend language like PHP or ASP.NET or something like that. I want to get back into... Okay. So when we name these, again, we choose the name. This name center is not a great name, and I'll tell you exactly why. We want to avoid naming anything that involves the look of it. So what do I mean by that? What if we decided that we didn't want to center this anymore? Like, what if it made sense just be the normal alignment? We changed our page around a little bit, and then all of a sudden we don't want it to be centered anymore. This is kind of silly because we have a class called center that's not actually centered. So what do we have to do? For every single page, we have to go back and give it a better name. What you want to generally stick to are names that kind of describe what the content is. And we did that before with announcement, due date, page title. These things describe what the content is or like its purpose. And as long as this purpose remains the same, as long as this is still an announcement, we can change around all the CSS and it's still an announcement. Maybe we decide actually we want announcements to be small text and we just want it to be like a muted color, like some sort of gray or something like that. We can do that. It's still an announcement. How the announcement looks is up to our interpretation. As soon as we start doing things that involve how it looks, it becomes very fragile. One of the most common things I see is where it'll say like top nav. Like say, for example, on your page you have navigation, and you, maybe you have two navigation systems. One's on the top of your page, one's on the side. And so you might want to call it like top nav and left nav. Well, the problem is that you might switch around the locations on your page, and then all of a sudden that's no longer a good name because you've said where it's located. You've said how it looks. What might be a better name might be primary nav and secondary nav. For example, like we'll go to use IRC. It has to be www. And once you start visiting some of these pages, let's say, for example, admissions, up here on the top, this might be the primary navigation system, but then they might have additional links, like this could be secondary. And on the old website, these links might have been over here on the left-hand side, and if they had called it like left nav or right nav or something like that, it'd be kind of silly because it's no longer on the left or right. But if you name things its purpose or its function, this would be the primary navigation that's available on every single page, and then each department might have like a secondary navigation, so that'd be a better name. Okay. Naming's important because it's one of those things that doesn't make sense right away until you've worked on a large project and you see all this weird naming and you're like, oh, they shouldn't have named that, but you kind of you created so many use instances of that class or that name that it's kind of like it's tough to go back and change things. Okay. So I think that's it for ID. There are some cascading rules, but I think we'll just cover those as we see them. I've mentioned a couple of other times, what's a good example here? Probably example number 1. What are called block level elements, or block level tags, and inline. A block level is anything that's going to take up the entire line and then add a new line at the end. Let's do this. So most browsers have some sort of developer tools. Firefox and Chrome's developer tools are somewhat the same. So this should be kind of similar. And then here there's something called the inspector, and you can actually see the so this is the rendered page on top, and this is the HTML below. Notice that when we hover over this H1, my page, that it takes up the entire line. Same thing with this paragraph. Even though the paragraph wraps around, at the end of that paragraph, it drops down to a new line. Same thing here. These are all what are called block level elements. Once you've used one, they take up the entire line, and then they drop to a new line at the end. Notice that this one right here, when I hover over it, this EM for emphasis, this only takes up as much as it needs to. This is called inline. So the two types of elements that we deal with are block level and inline. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what's called the box model. And for the most part, we don't really care about inline for the box model for right now anyway. I think it still applies, but I very, very rarely use it. Most of the time we're concerned with the box model for block level elements. So paragraphs, H1s, articles. I'm sure there's a list on W3 schools of each kind. So within W3 schools CSS, there's something here called the box model. And so let's think about a specific tag. Let's say paragraph. Within a paragraph, there's the actual content. In this case, our paragraph is going to be here would be the actual content, the lorem ipsum. Same thing here. Then we have some area between the content and this thing called a border. That's called the padding. And then we have some stuff between the border and either the edge of the page or other elements. That area is called the margin. We can actually see that right here. They have a nice little, I don't know what this is, it just says box model here. And these colors are actually a little bit more distinct in Chrome. You'll notice here that for this first paragraph, the yellow is the margin, so you can see the dotted line there. And then we have sort of like an invisible border. It's a 0 pixel border. I know it's kind of tough to see, but you'll see right here it says the number of pixels, and Chrome has a very similar layout. So whatever browser you're using, you'll see something similar in the box model. And I think they actually even call it the same thing. I think they just call it the inspector. So we see the number of pixels here. So by default, we got 18 pixels. Now we never really defined that margin. That's just the default for that. If we went up to H1, notice that we see different values. Here it gave more margin. By default, each element gets certain styling. Okay, we can overwrite that. There's a couple of ways to do that. We can do that manually with our own styles, or there are reset scripts where it just resets everything to all values to pretty much 0, and then you go from there. But for this class, we're not going to do that too much. We'll just, as needed, we'll override things. So we see some margin here. It had no border, no padding, and then over here we have the actual content. Let's look at the paragraph here. Same thing, no padding, no border. We do get some margin by default, and then this area right here, that's going to be our content. So let's file new, create a new page here, and let's just do a big block of, normally I try to keep it small, but let's grab a really large block of lorem ipsum here so we can really get a sense of how this works. Actually, so getting ahead of myself. So HTML shell, and we're going to do one paragraph. We'll save this as ex4.html, and then we'll paste in one paragraph. So get to that point. So make a new HTML file, copy and paste HTML shell, and then let's get to where we have one paragraph of lorem ipsum. And because we're going to be writing a lot of code, we could do this inline because we're only going to have the one paragraph. But inside of head, let's get used to not using inline. You don't actually tend to use inline that much because it's a little bit fragile. Imagine if you have a very, very large site and you want to have a consistent look and feel. Every time you use inline, you've kind of broken that. And there's examples of people using like 50, maybe an exaggeration, but many, many, many different fonts and font sizes, font colors, just all kinds of different inconsistent styling. So you kind of want to avoid inline. It's not the worst thing in the world, but you generally want to create classes for things. So let's say we're inside of the head section. We want to create style. And let's just say we have one called due date, class called due date, and we'll apply it here. So let's say class is equal to due date. And how do we know that it was a class? We have that dot in front of it. And remember, so this represents that it's a class, but we don't actually use it down here because the actual name is due date. This is just kind of like an extra character to let, when it's parsing, to let it know that it's a class. So then what we'll do here is, looking at the inspector, notice that both H1 and paragraph, by default, it set the border to 0 pixels. So let's change that. Let's actually at least get to where we can see our border. And there's like an extended syntax for CSS that we can set a bunch of things at once. So let's just say we want it to be where we can see it. Let's say 1 pixel solid red. And that just sets multiple properties at the same time. So it's going to be setting like the border. I don't know what the property name is. I use this shorthand notation a lot for this. And it's going to be solid the options there are like solid, dotted, something else, I don't know. And then here would be our color. Give us the options? No, I guess not. And now we go over to our paragraph, and now magically we do see the border. And what do we see all around? From here, here, here. Obviously you can't really see it on the bottom, but it exists on the bottom. That area is called our margin. Okay, the stuff from here right up to the border, that's called padding. And you'll remember from before, by default we had no padding, no border, but we did have some margin by default. So we can get a sense of what the padding looks like. Let's also set the padding. Let's give it 10 pixels of padding. And you should see here, now that we've got the area between the border and the actual content, the padding, we actually have some padding to work with now. And just so we get some practice, we'll just say that some very large value, just so we can get a good sense of what the margin looks like. Notice now we have a huge amount of margin. And you'll notice that by default, this wants to take up the entire width of the page. So sort of unrelated to the box model, but it's all these things are kind of used together, even though they're separate concepts and separate like things in CSS. What we'll very often do is set a fixed width. And let's say 300 pixels. So you'll see now that rather than taking up the full width of the page and wrapping as needed, it only takes up as much as it needs to. And we could kind of visually see that, but maybe it'll be a little bit more clear if we open it up in a browser. So I'm going to open this up, and then I'll open up the tools again here in Web Developer, Tools. And then I'm going to go to this paragraph. I think I can, okay, well, so I know it's kind of tough to see. I'll read you the values. Here we have, as I hover over it, this yellow, this is 25 pixels, which is exactly what we set. Here we have a border of 0.8 pixels. I don't want to get into the details of that specifically. Sometimes things aren't going to be pixel perfect. That's all I'll say about that. But it'll be close enough. Sometimes you'll be off by 1 or 2 pixels depending on certain factors. And then we set a little bit of padding, and then here we have our actual content. Now when we're using a fixed width page, one of the techniques that we can do is, rather than setting the margin manually, this area all along here and here, and then it's kind of difficult to see here and here because we've made it, just naturally it's going to not show up at the bottom, but because we've made this fixed width, one of the things that we can do is, rather than setting the margin manually, what we can do is we can use the special value called auto. And what that does is it says spread out the margin and equally, and it doesn't really make sense to do it on the top and bottom. So in practice, it only ends up spreading it out on the left and right hand sides. And that has the effect of centering it. So this can be kind of a useful technique for centering things. Now notice that if I take away the fixed width property, rather than saying I want it to be 300 pixels, I just say take up as much room as you want. It's not really centered anymore because it's taking up the whole thing. If it takes up the whole thing, the concept of centering doesn't really make sense anymore. So keep that in mind, that really only has meaning, this margin auto, when we've set it to a fixed width, because then it says, okay, well, what do I do with all this extra space? And remember, because it's block level, it's going to take up this entire thing right here. If I added any new content, that content would be below. So because it knows it can take up this whole, I don't want to say row, but that's kind of what you can think of as like a conceptual model, is that it's taking up this entire row or line, and then it drops down to a new line, and everything in here is kind of encompassed or encapsulated by the box model. Remember our margin, our border, our content, our padding, all that stuff. So we can do that. So I think that's about as much as I want to do with that example. So just leave this up here for a second. This right here, this idea of a fixed width div with automatic margins is going to be, in this case it wasn't even a div, it was a paragraph. I probably said fixed width div a few times. I'm just catching myself now. This fixed width technique can be used pretty much on any block level tag. Most often we tend to use it with div. Div is very generic, and so it's kind of nice to use with a div. But in this case, you can see we used it with a paragraph. But it's very often that we use a div. Div is very generic. It just means division. We've just got some sort of divided content. We're not really saying if it's a paragraph or an article or a header or a footer or anything. We're just saying it's some sort of division of content. Okay, so let's experiment a little bit here with, so we'll start with HTML shell. We'll talk about floats or floating or some variant of that. So this is going to be ex5.html. And as I previously mentioned a couple minutes ago, we're going to be using these div tags a lot. So let's go ahead and put a div in there. And there is a site for images. I think I have a link in here somewhere. Probably be near the top. That's all right, we can search for it. I think this one works pretty well. Okay, so it's pixum.photos. We'll use this one right here of the dog. And so all we do is highlight this, copy it. Now if you remember, to have an image, we just do that. By the way, all this means is that we're guaranteed to always get, because otherwise it randomizes it. I like to just always have a consistent picture. You can randomize it if you want as well, but so here we're always going to get the puppy, and then it's going to be 200 by 300. Close that out. Let's just view it just to make sure that everything's working okay, and there's really not much to it. That works perfect. Okay, and then let's also do a paragraph of lorem ipsum text. And we might actually need a large block of text. We might have to change some of these sizes around. We'll worry about that in a second. And I'm just gonna shrink this back to a value. It's kind of reasonable to work with. And if you can't find the website, you can just manually type this in. So we have a div, an image, the source is pointing to the image of the dog, and then we have a paragraph of text. Now what's very common is, if say this were like a newspaper article, what we typically want to do is we want to have some sort of image and then text wrapping around it. So we don't want these to be like our typical block level where we have an image and then on the next line our text. So what we can do is we can interrupt that normal flow with what's called a float. So what we do is I don't know. Let's do it up here inside of head. I try not to put too much down here in the body. It would probably made sense as just inline, but there would have been too much down there. So let's say so we get some practice with IDs. We'll call this, say this is some sort of news article. We could call it, we'll keep it simple. We'll just call it article IMG for image. And what we're going to do with that is we're going to use this special property called float, and we want to float it left. And here we have to apply the ID. Still ended up wrapping. Trying to avoid that. And now we can see here the two are side by side. Now, what could we do so that this text is not directly up against the image? Well, we already learned from the box model that just something as basic as margin, so we can put a little bit of margin in there if we wanted to. Just keep it a small value, 10 pixels. And if you didn't want to see how it's kind of all messed up, what you could do is specifically just say, okay, only the margin on the right side. Now notice that it just added margin. Let's just add a larger value so we really get a sense of that we're adding margin here. It's probably larger than we use in the real world, but I just wanted you to get a very clear sense of where the margin is going. Now we can also combine that with our technique from before. If you remember that you might not want this to run the full width of the page, what we could do is we've already wrapped it inside of a div. With that div, we could And let's do this actually. So put it up here. A very common name for a fixed width block level element is called container. It's just a very generic name. It's going to be some sort of container. And that container is going to be, say, 400 pixels wide and margin auto. And then here we would say, okay, the div that holds both of these things is going to be using this class called container. Note again, the dot means that it's a class, and up here the hash indicates that it's an ID. But notice down here when we actually use them, we didn't put that in front, okay, because that's not really a part of the name. And then you'll notice here, it's probably way too narrow. We would change the width a little bit in the real world, but you get an idea of what's going on. The reason, one of the reasons I put it so narrow is that note that once the image is done, that it went back to wrapping the full width of the div. Now, I don't want to get too much into explaining this right now, but there's something called the clear fix hack that once you're done using these floats, it can cause problems with the layout of the rest of your page. So once you're, in this case, we really only wanted this image and this paragraph to be floated. So we wanted the paragraph text to wrap around the image. To kind of reset everything back to normal flow and normal layout, and you can Google this if you want more detail. It's called the clear fix hack. But we'll just do div, style, and then it's clear both. So this little piece of code, you don't necessarily need to understand fully. Just remember to always put this, make a little note to yourself that anytime we are done using floats, put that, and then it'll, otherwise you get these kind of strange behavior of things not going where you think they are supposed to go on the page. It's like, why does stuff seem like it's floating in all different places? It's this clears out any floating behavior. So let's do an example that'll kind of get you started on your assignment. Okay, so this won't be everything you need for the assignment. We'll do another full example next class. But the basics of the assignment is that you're going to have a fixed width landing page, and we'll get into some of these details. But I want to give you the basic technique, and this is actually based on the IRC, the old website. What they would do is, I wish I had a screenshot of it, but it's still a very common technique, is to have a fixed width div and then multiple what we'll call boxes inside. So it'll make sense as we go. So let's just start with HTML shell. This will be ex6.html. And let's set a couple things up here. So inside of the head section, we're going to style. Inside of the body, I already kind of mentioned that. And rather than div, we already used div. Let's use main. Let's get out of trying to use same tags over and over again. And we're going to have a container just like before. And let's make it a little bit wider. Let's say 700, let's say 800 pixels. So we do width, 800 pixels. Just so we can see the edges of the container, for now, let's give it a border. We're eventually going to get rid of this. And we want to center it in the page like before, so we set the margin to auto, and that evenly distributes the margin on the left and right hand side. Now we've created this class called container, but we're not using it anywhere, so a good place to use it maybe inside of main. Now we don't have any content yet, but we should get something that sort of indicates what's going on here. Okay. So we don't have any content to fill it with yet, but we do see that at the very least it's got the proper width and it's centered. So we're going to have two boxes of content. We're going to basically have like a two-column layout. And we'll just very generically call it box. We'd normally come up with a better name than this, but this will work for now. And the idea of the two-column layout is, in our case, we're just going to say that they're even widths. So we have an 800 pixel container. Now we could do 400 and 400, but the problem is that different things cause little stray pixels here and there. So what I usually do is I just say, okay, rather than adding up to 800 exactly, which can cause some very subtle problems, let's go a little bit less than that. So what we're going to say for these boxes is that we're going to have a width of 385 pixels. That should be enough room. Now normally you don't want to give these boxes a height. You want to let the content fill it, but right now we don't have any content, so let's make it truly a box here. So we'll say the height is I don't know, like 300 pixels. And just so we see what's going on here, let's go ahead and give it a border. Something besides red, let's say yellow. And then a background color, just so we can kind of, again, see what's going on here. Just something very subtle, so something light here. And dark colors, whatever. So we've got a container to contain everything, and then we're going to have a two-column layout. We're going to have two boxes. So within that, let's have a couple of divs. And they're going to be both a part of this class called box. So, sorry, I went a little too fast. So you can see right now these are stacked on top of each other. But you should kind of start to realize that, oh, well, yes, these are stacked on top of each other, but learning this thing that we did last time, I can actually float these. So what I can do here is I can say style equals, I want to float this one left. And we also have a float right. And remember, when we're done floating things, we want to do this thing called the clear fix hack. So we say style equals clear both. And what this will do is this will put the boxes side by side. And now we've created a two-column layout. Now, I will tell you this is an older technique using floats like this. And it really only works for two-column layouts. You can do it for more, but it gets very hard to manage. So I would say, if you're just doing two columns and you know you're going to stick to two columns, this is probably okay. But now we have things called grid, which applies to however many columns you want. So this really only tends to work for 2 columns, but it's still okay if that's all you're going for, is you're going to be working with 2 columns. And then notice that we get our couple of columns side by side here. So I think that's a good stopping point for this week, is that we have our 2-column layout. What I would suggest, it's actually going to be, so this lecture and next lecture, is that you're going to be essentially making a 2-column page. So I would sit down with just pen and paper, or pencil and paper, and sketch out a 2-column page. So it's going to be very minimalistic. You're not going to have a huge amount of stuff there, but at the very least, you're probably going to want some banner across the top, and we'll talk about the technique for that next week. So you have a banner, probably want some sort of footer. You're going to have 2-column layout. Inside of there, we're going to add a little bit of content. You're going to have a navigation across the top, and just start to sketch things out. I'll explain this assignment a little bit more next week, so it'll make a little bit more sense. But you have enough this week to kind of start to think about, okay, I've got the basic tools and techniques to start doing some of these things. So, yeah. Okay, so any questions in the classroom? I know we only have one person. You're all right? And then if anybody has any questions at home for anything, email is probably the best way to get a hold of me. And then don't forget, since these are recorded, you can watch them as many times as you want and slow them down if you want to. And when I get a chance later today, I'll also post all the code examples under class examples, okay? And then and you can always retrieve old examples. I didn't post the first week because we really didn't do much, but this is last week's, and then I'll post this week. As far as the assignments go, make sure that, don't forget about this assignment. I would say try to have this done by today. Don't wait till the end of the week. And then just email me if you have any questions. Okay, all right, stay safe, and then you know how to contact